So I'm currently on the Pacific Ocean, on the shores of Mexico, and it's really a wonderful place to rest and recover. It's also a wonderful place to get a lot of sunburn. And while being here, I thought of working on a project that's been on my mind for a very long time, and that is a presentation, a translator presentation in this case, since I'm not a teacher, especially not a capital T teacher, a translator presentation on the 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas as applied to the field of so-called queer Dharma. And the queer Dharma itself is not really its own new Buddhist tradition or old Buddhist tradition. It's just a convenient way of referring to the teachings of Buddhism and by extension maybe other Dharmic traditions as they apply to the lived experience of queer people and queer practitioners in particular. And this, of course, covers both what we as queer practitioners can do with our own body, speech, and mind in order to be happier and to be a more positive presence in this world. And that also applies to seeing the challenges that queer people face in order to understand what could be changed and transformed so that the world is more inclusive, so that the world is more welcoming, so that the world is less violent towards us and towards other types of beings as well. And I think, in a way, literally any Buddhist teaching could be presented as a teaching on queer Dharma simply if it is being covered by a queer teacher, by a queer translator, by a queer practitioner who's just sharing their experience of applying something to their own lived experience, to their own life. And from that point of view, covering something like the 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas could be a great introduction to the field, in that this is one of the most important Lojong texts on mind training, or as I like to refer it, attitude bending. And at the same time, this text, while presenting the overall ethos of Lojong or mind training teachings, this text deals a lot with transforming suffering into the path, or transforming suffering into happiness, helping us make the best out of the difficult experiences that we might be having. So from this point of view, for those of us who are primarily turning to the Dharma in order to find a way to be able to deal with our suffering with greater grace and ease, this is a perfect teaching. And in my own case, this was the very first teaching that I received when I first attended the teachings by the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in 2010. I believe that was the very first text I heard him cover. I've read many, many commentaries on the text since then. I've heard commentaries, oral commentaries from many different teachers, and read many written commentaries or commentaries that are based on transcripts. And it's just a text that is so lovely to contemplate on a regular basis. In particular, one of my primary teachers and the teacher for whom I have the greatest respect, Garchen Rinpoche, sometimes says that this text is his representative in the world, and that by studying this text, we're bringing, essentially, that's the meaning, we're bringing ourselves closer to the qualities that he, meaning Garchen Rinpoche, possesses and has been able to embody through his own practice, through his own study, contemplation, and meditation. So that's the idea. And so the context of the text is that it was written by Gyalse Thogme Zangpo, who was a great practitioner of compassion, associated sometimes with the Sakya and Kadam traditions. He is not very easy to classify in that regard because he lived at a relatively early stage of Tibetan history where things were not necessarily as clear-cut as they became later and as they stayed until the dawn of the non-sectarian movement in Eastern Tibet in the 19th century. And one thing that is always emphasized when Thogme Zangpo's biography is covered is that ever since he was a child, he possessed the greatest compassion, to the point where, being a young child, he mistakenly, or I guess on purpose, but through some confusion, gave his coat to a bush, thinking that the bush was a being that needed to be protected from the cold. So just this quality of natural spontaneous compassion was always present in his heart and was later enhanced through additional training and combined with the qualities of wisdom. So now when we're reading his texts, including the text of the 13 Practices of Bodhisattvas, we see that he's providing an incredible insight, or incredible insights, into also the wisdom side of things. And Thogme Zangpo has many other compositions that are still with us to this day. He is an influential figure in the transmission of the 7 points of mind training. He has some texts on transforming sickness into the path. And just in general, this whole tradition that encompasses Shantideva's seminal text, Entry to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, that encompasses mind training in 7 points, mind training in 8 verses, 37 practices of Bodhisattvas. Thogme Zangpo is an incredibly important part of this lineage of transmission. And in regards to these texts, I like to sometimes say that we could think that Shantideva's Entry to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life is kind of the foundational root text, which is, amongst these, is the most expansive, and certainly studying it is a very wonderful thing to do. Fairly important in that it provides foundational learning when it comes to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It provides foundational insights into not just the Bodhisattva way of life per se, or the Bodhisattva conduct, but just in general into Buddhism as a whole, and into the Mahayana Buddhism at least, helping us form an indispensable foundation for any other type of Mahayana practice that we might want to undertake. And this includes the practices of Vajrayana, which forms a part of Mahayana. And then, so that's the foundation. And then on the basis of that, these shorter texts were compiled, including the 37 practices, the 8 verses, and the 7 points, and many others as well. But these 3 are the most important in terms of how many people currently study them. There are many commentaries written on all of them. And amongst these 37 practices, and the text of the 37 practices is the more expansive one. If we read commentaries on that, it provides us with a lot of detail, actually. And then the 7 points of mind training are a bit more quintessential. And at the same time, they are oriented, you could say, a little bit more towards practitioners who have really already familiarized themselves, well, first of all, with the foundational teachings, but beyond that, with the teachings on wisdom in particular. Why that is that most versions of the 7-point mind training, after the preliminary stages, first cover the topic of the ultimate bodhicitta, and that already requires some understanding of the wisdom teachings of Buddhism. And then they cover a relative bodhicitta or conventional bodhicitta, and after that offer additional bits of advice on transforming the mind and transforming our attitude to different situations. So that's how it usually works. There are some later editions of the 7 points of mind training which place conventional bodhicitta first, which is probably the order that most of us would be more comfortable with, at least if we are a beginner. And then after that comes ultimate bodhicitta, and then the rest of the points. These editions also exist, in particular in the Gelug tradition, but most presentations start with ultimate bodhicitta, which for some people would be a bit advanced, although not necessarily, because we live in the day and age where through familiarizing ourselves with such fields of knowledge as quantum physics or even philosophy in general, if we study philosophy of different countries and different traditions in general, through all of that, we might become fairly open to the teachings that are presented in the ultimate bodhicitta side of things. But for the 37 practices, they take us through the stages of the path in a very gentle and orderly manner. They start with the more foundational teachings, and in the Gelug tradition, these more foundational teachings would form the earlier stages or the earlier scopes of Lamrim, or stages of the path. From that point of view, the 37 practices, this text can be categorized as both a Lamrim text and a Lojong text. That it is a text that teaches us to bend our attitudes in a positive, constructive way. So that's a Lojong text, mind training text or attitude bending text to describe it in a slightly facetious way. And at the same time, it is an orderly presentation of the stages of training, in particular when it comes to discursive meditations that help us shift our perspective on life. And then from that point of view, because it's taking us through the stages of training, it is a Lamrim text, a text on the stages of the path. Both statements are true. It all depends on simply how we want to work with it. So for the first practice that is covered in the text, and in this case, I'll read it out in the translation by the Padmakara translation group. For the first practice, this is where we start the journey. This first practice is preceded by general verse of Thogme Zangpo paying homage to Avalokiteshvara and then praising Avalokiteshvara as an embodiment of all the qualities that we want to work on by working with the 37 practices. And that is something that I personally find incredibly inspiring. Avalokiteshvara is a universal figure, sometimes described as a bodhisattva and sometimes described as a fully enlightened Buddha, and sometimes described as kind of a universal reality that lies at the foundation, forms the basis, a substrate for all individual Buddhas. But Avalokiteshvara is this universal figure that is particularly associated with the quality of compassion. Yes, compassion, altruism, conventional bodhicitta, loving kindness, even all of these qualities that belong to the compassion side, they are in a way included in Avalokiteshvara. They form a part of his portfolio, or their portfolio, because Avalokiteshvara manifests in all sorts of forms of different gender expressions and so forth. That's true. But in addition to that, Avalokiteshvara is powerfully associated with the qualities of wisdom as well. And this is most powerfully emphasized and expressed in the Heart Sutra, where Avalokiteshvara is the narrator of the sutra, of the teachings on wisdom in the sutra itself. And one of my primary mentors, Jigani Rinpoche, has recently mentioned in one of the seminars that I've had the great privilege of interpreting for, that we do want to embody the compassion of Kuan Yin, or Avalokiteshvara, or Chinrezi in Tibetan. That's a very important thing to do. But at the same time, we do want to embody the wisdom of Avalokiteshvara, for the wisdom as it is expressed in the Heart Sutra. And so, in paying homage to Avalokiteshvara, in this case, Thogme Zangpo is kind of presenting that universal ideal to us. Avalokiteshvara is also praised as being inseparable, or seen as being inseparable with our actual teachers. And our actual teachers in this case refers to both our teachers made of flesh and blood who are instructing us on the path, but also all the lineage or ancestral teachers, and eventually the ultimate teachers that are inseparable from our own Buddha nature and the enlightened mind of all the Buddhas. So it's all kind of fused into one and praised. And this is how Thogme Zangpo expresses it To the sublime teacher inseparable from Avalokiteshvara, the protector of beings, I pay constant homage with respectful body, speech, and mind. The perfect Buddha's source of happiness and ultimate peace exists through having accomplished the sacred Dharma, and that in turn depends on knowing how to practice it. This practice of the Bodhisattvas I shall therefore now explain. We had to relocate because of some announcements outside. But that's good because now we're closer to the ocean. Anyhow, with regards to the text of the 37 practices, there are some commentaries which are very technical in nature because they cover the visualizations and prayers and things like that that could be done to create a very conducive context within our mind for us to then do the discursive meditations on the 37 practices, therefore absorbing their meaning more fully. And there are also commentaries, and these seem to be more prevalent, at least in regards to the translations that are available in English, that just cover the meaning of each verse, occasionally also offering some practical tips of how to implement a specific verse in our daily life. So amongst those, the two that I would recommend in this case are by two of my wonderful female teachers. One is a commentary by Venerable Thupten Chodron, and that's called Don't Believe Everything You Think. And there's also a shorter version of that, which is compiled on the basis of some oral teachings that she delivered at one point. And another commentary is by Gyalse Tenzin Palmo, and that's called The Heroic Heart, Awakening Boundless Compassion. Gyalse Tenzin Palmo is probably extremely well known as someone who's done 12 years of retreat in a Himalayan cave. There's an incredible book about her called Cave in the Snow by Vicky Mackenzie. But even outside of those accomplishments, when you listen to her, you just recognize game. You recognize that that's a person who's really been practicing very diligently in their life. So from that point of view, that's a commentary that is really worthy of our attention. And then beyond that, there are some more traditional commentaries from the 19th century. And before that, there are some commentaries by the teachers of the times more recent, including a commentary compiled from some oral teachings Holiness the Dalai Lama delivered a few decades ago. There's a commentary by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, which is quite popular, and many, many others. And we can actually find many cycles in which commentaries to this text are delivered orally, and these cycles are available on different video and audio platforms as well. Amongst those, there are probably quite a few videos with Garchen Rinpoche and his immediate disciples delivering these commentaries, so just lots of wonderful material. But in this case, I think what's of value potentially is just talking about these verses, looking into their word meaning, as it's called, and where we unpack a specific concept just to introduce our mind to the way this concept is understood and include the traditional Mahayana framework. And then beyond that, just as sort of a translator introduction, taking a few moments to recognize how each specific point could be considered or contemplated from a Mahayana queer point of view. So now I have this fluffy thing to make sure the wind is not affecting the sound. Anyhow, so for the first verse, which really opens the text, here's what the Padmakara translation group has as their version of it. Now that I have this great ship, a precious human life so hard to obtain, I must carry myself and others across the ocean of samsara. To that end, to listen, reflect, and meditate day and night without distraction is the practice of a bodhisattva. So each of the main verses ends on this note of this is the practice of a bodhisattva, because the main 37 verses of the text introduce very specific practices that could be done. And at the same time, it's kind of also true that each verse on occasion introduces a number of different practices that could be done. This verse is no exception. It has quite a few points that are to be applied. And just in terms of this preliminary concept introduction, The first thing to unpack here is probably the idea of the ocean of samsara. So that's the second line in this particular version. I must carry myself and others across the ocean of samsara. So one thing that's fairly common and commented upon quite frequently when these types of teachings are delivered, whether in the Lamrim, Lorjan context, or just in a general introduction to Buddhism. One of the things that are often mentioned is that samsara is not a place, contrary to common beliefs in the West, where we envision samsara as just being this world and then nirvana as something that is akin to a heavenly dimension. The technical definition of it is that it's our contaminated existence, the existence in which we are essentially our body and mind, or our five constituent aggregates, are contaminated by primordial ignorance and the derivative afflictions, the derivative mental states that distort our perception of reality. So as long as we're abiding in this contaminated state, we are said to be in samsara, where we experience the different types of dukkha or discomfort. And as soon as we have purified our aggregates, it's said that we have reached something that's beyond samsara, and there are different levels of that as well. But the idea of it being like an ocean is not simply in terms of the vastness of it. It's not simply to say that, well, there's a lot of suffering, so it's vast as an ocean, and I'm sitting in front of the ocean right now. It's vast as an ocean, so therefore, okay, we are all suffering, and we're basically deep in the suffering together. The idea is also that on the surface of the ocean, there are waves, and these waves come up and down, and as they come up and down in a similar way, when abiding in this contaminated existence, we're said to experience the different types of dukkha. To say it once again, I must carry myself and others across the ocean of samsara. So samsara is compared to an ocean not simply in terms of its vastness and the magnitude of suffering that we experience, which is also fair. The waves on the surface of the ocean come up and down, and in a similar way, the different types of dukkha that we experience are said to come and go. And a famous dedication prayer, it's very often recited in the Nyingma tradition in particular, but not only, talks about the waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death that we aspire to be liberated from, but not just personally. We're not only aiming to liberate ourselves from that, we are praying in this dedication prayer, we're directing our merit, our positive potential towards the goal of liberating all beings from these waves. And I think, and that's kind of one of the points that Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo mentions in her commentary, seeing our experiences of suffering as being akin to waves that come up and down is pretty good mind training technique on its own, in itself. We have all these daily situations that bring us discomfort. Over the last couple of weeks, I've had plenty of unpleasant experiences associated with my gum health and my dental health. And when you are experiencing that discomfort, that suffering on its own, it might seem like a fairly stable, solid thing that's just there, and you don't want it to be there. That's the technical umbrella definition of suffering in Buddhism, something that we want to be liberated from when it's happening, something that we want to avoid when it's not happening. But if we were to step outside of it from a temporal point of view and look at it as, oh, when does it appear? When does it abide? When does it disappear? We would see that it comes and goes like waves. But while this type of suffering is decreasing temporarily because, let's say, I'm recovering from this dental problem, or I've had proper treatment, something else comes up, and then something else, and then something else, and these waves keep coming up and down again and again. I'm back to the room, and it's the next day. And I think the point that we last covered there was this idea of samsara being like an ocean where there are constantly waves coming up and down and tossing us around. And probably the main point for me is that, yes, samsara is extremely vast and it is an ocean of dukkha or discomfort. That's one thing. So when we realize the vastness of that suffering, we do want to eventually become liberated from that. But the other point is that even though we are constantly tossed by these waves, up and down, we can still maintain a level of inner equilibrium, inner balance, inner strength. And in general, the text of the 37 practices teaches us how to do that. And yet, I think it's helpful to, when I encounter suffering, to just remind myself, well, these are the waves of samsara. That's okay. Doesn't mean I become passive, doesn't mean I become complacent, doesn't mean I just accept it in a way where I'm not trying to liberate myself and others from suffering, but just having that recognition of, yes, that's part of the process, that's part of contaminated existence. That makes things a little bit easier. Then the next concept here, and that's the first line in the Padmakara translation, is related to the idea of our precious human life being like a great ship or a boat. So the line itself goes, now that I have this great ship, a precious human life so hard to obtain. So the precious human life is a very specific term in Mahayana Buddhism, in the Indo-Tibetan tradition of Buddhism in particular, Mi Lu Rinpoche in Tibetan. What it refers to is not any type of human existence. And this is, of course, something that requires an explanation in that if we were to say, well, not every human life is a precious human life, if we misread that to mean that we're denying the preciousness of the lives of certain human beings or certain beings in general, that would be a pretty big mistake. The idea here is that amongst the different types of human birth, and of course, every human birth is precious in that it needs to be protected, it needs to be respected and treated with utmost respect, actually. Amongst all the different types of human birth, there's a very specific combination of factors that is referred to with this technical term of a precious human rebirth. What is this unique combination of factors? When this concept is unpacked, it is often presented in terms of the so-called 8 freedoms and 10 advantages, or 10 positive conjunctures, combinations of factors, essentially. 10 endowments, also, this term is sometimes used as a translation. And the idea there is that essentially we are free to practice the Dharma, we have the opportunities to practice the Dharma, and we have the interest with regards to the Dharma. So the difference between just a regular human rebirth, which is, of course, precious, just like any other life, and this very technical term of a precious human rebirth or a precious human life is with regards to our ability to practice the Dharma. Once again, that does not mean that people who do not have interest in the Dharma or do not practice the Dharma are less precious in terms of the value of their existence or their right to exist. Not at all. But the idea of preciousness here is supposed to inspire us to practice. The discursive meditations related to the precious human rebirth are done in order for us to recognize what a unique opportunity we have right now, knowing that this opportunity is indeed temporary. We're not going to have it forever. That's covered in one of the future verses. And that this opportunity that we have right now was created through a great number of absolutely unique factors coming together. That's what's quite powerful. It is explained that in order for us to possess this so-called precious human rebirth, we had to accumulate an incredible amount of merit in the past. We had to create the positive karma of abstaining from killing and harming others. We had to probably create a lot of positive karma related to generosity, because otherwise we would not possess any resources in this life. And we do need the outer material resources to a certain degree in order to practice the Dharma. We do need food, we do need shelter, and so forth. We also probably had to seal that accumulation of positive karmic energy with special prayers of dedication. It is sometimes said that in order to actually obtain a precious human rebirth, we probably had to keep some moral vows of behavior that helped us accumulate merit more efficiently by also preventing us from undertaking certain negative actions. And then a combination of all of these things is what led us to obtaining this precious human life. And this is, I think, where queer Dharma kind of kicks in that this is where it's valuable to contemplate not just the fact that we do indeed have a precious human rebirth. And if we are interested in the Dharma and we have access to the Dharma, we do possess a precious human rebirth. It's interesting to contemplate the uniqueness potentially of our personal situation, let's say, as a queer practitioner. And of course, similar contemplations can be done with many other identities that we might have. Every identity, in a way, could be turned into a tool that helps us further our practice of the Dharma and further our service to other sentient beings. But specifically with regards to queerness in the world that largely still to this day does not accept it eagerly and often tries to destroy it actively. With regards to this, one aspect that could be recognized is that many of us, naturally, or through the way human society is organized right now, have experienced a lot of additional dukkha, a lot of extra dukkha that does not necessarily manifest in the lives of those who do fit in with the cis heteronormative society. And what this means is that we probably have had experiences of alienation, of being excluded, maybe not having an opportunity to be ourselves openly. We probably had to have a prolonged period of self-questioning, trying to understand who we are and whether our romantic leanings and so forth are, or our gender identity and all of that, whether it could fit in with basically the fabric of society that we live in, and then whether we can create chosen families for ourselves in case our biological families were not particularly open with us, or in some cases, of course, it's even worse. So all of these things, all of these unique types of suffering, all of these very specific types of dukkha that queer people have to go through, all of those, they, of course, were painful. And of course, we might still be carrying the remnants of some of those experiences as trauma. But what's interesting is that for many of us, these experiences provide us with a wonderful opportunity to cultivate greater degrees of compassion and wisdom. Many of these experiences have taught us a lot about suffering. So if we respond to these experiences wisely, and that's kind of the ethos of the 37 practices, all of those experiences could be turned into a standing ground, into the foundation for us to deepen both wisdom and compassion. And that's where we can additionally contemplate that as an aspect of the preciousness of our human rebirth as well. Not in the sense that we are above anyone else or superior or anything like that, because that's a thing that people who do not belong to the queer community often are afraid of. They think, oh, queer people think that they're better, and then I feel inferior, and so I'm going to lash out and respond with anger and hatred and so forth. That's not the idea here. The idea simply is to recognize what we have and what we have experienced and how much fuel essentially we have to cultivate wisdom and compassion. People who have undergone these experiences do not necessarily turn them into wisdom or compassion. Sometimes we can be so deeply hurt by these things that we become even more self-centered, even more narcissistic, even more harmful with regards to others in terms of how we treat them. That happens all the time, of course. And yet the challenge here is to look at our mind with a certain degree of honesty and then say, hey, well, I have all this fuel. I have had all this dukkha, all these uncomfortable experiences. So in a way, I do already have more fuel to turn into the fire of practice than maybe some other people who have had a very privileged existence up until now, and so simply have not had the chance to face the more deep or more expansive types of suffering. So that's something to recognize as well. And then, of course, another thing that these contemplations of the precious human rebirth are supposed to do for us is that they teach us about the preciousness of our existence, therefore protecting us from the feeling that we're worthless and should not even be alive. And that's a common experience for many people I know as well. just through being maligned by society, essentially described as someone who does not deserve to love, does not deserve to live, does not deserve a right to marry, yada, yada, yada. All of these things that we're being force-fed for most of our life, essentially, until or unless we find communities that show us safety, acceptance, and love. All of these things can really transform into very toxic feeling that we should not even exist, and that we should end this existence, maybe. And then recognizing the preciousness of our human rebirth, the preciousness of the opportunity that we have right now, this precious, unique chance to cultivate our heart and mind, maybe even become realized, maybe even become fully enlightened. That's not fully impossible either. Recognizing that and allowing that to be fully embedded in the depths of our bones through doing these discursive meditations again and again and again, through reminding ourselves of these points again and again and again throughout the day, keeping it in mind and reminding ourselves about this again and again and again until it becomes a natural part of our worldview. That's the idea that is behind these contemplations and these teachings, really. So when the topic, the theme of the precious human rebirth is presented in the Lamrim literature on the stages of the path and the Gelug tradition and the old Kadam tradition, or when it's presented as one of the four mind turnings or mind changings or mental revolutions in the so-called preliminary practices in Ngondro, and that's common to Sakya, Hagyu, and Nyingma traditions. Whenever that theme is introduced, the idea is for practitioners to then contemplate it very deeply and not simply contemplate it as in read books about it or maybe talk to their friends about it a little bit. Those are all valuable things, of course. No, there is an idea that we should be doing a lot of discursive practice, discursive meditation, analytical meditation with it. And then we do that until it is very deeply embedded in our worldview. Ergo, the name, the four revolutions or the four mental changings, the four mental turnings, Lodok Namshi in Tibetan. So, what we can do with this verse is, yes, recognize that we are in an ocean of samsara, and then do some meditation on the preciousness of our human rebirth as much as possible. And even if it is not yet formal meditation that we could do by using certain guided practices that teach us or show us how to meditate on the preciousness of our human rebirth, even if it's not yet that, just to contemplate it deeply is already a good start. It's valuable to look into the more traditional and expansive teachings on what a precious human rebirth is and how to meditate on it. There's lots of incredible literature available now, translated from Tibetan, so we could work with all of that. And then, with all of this, with a recognition that our precious human rebirth is indeed wonderfully rare and is not to be taken for granted, with that, we then turn to the next line, which says, to that end, to listen, reflect, and meditate. And then the next one, day and night without distraction is the practice of a bodhisattva. So this verse is teaching us to recognize the preciousness of our current human rebirth, our precious human rebirth in particular. But then how do we use that human rebirth wisely? We need to cultivate the three types of wisdom, the three wisdoms that it's sometimes described. The wisdom of listening, the wisdom of reflection, and the wisdom of meditation. These are the three stages of essentially learning that are very commonly described in the Indo-Tibetan tradition of Buddhism. So how do we go through them? Listening refers to any act of, yes, indeed, listening when we're listening to, let's say, a Dharma talk by someone, but it also refers to reading. It also refers to consuming media, material, so video, audio, podcasts, essentially anything that teaches us about the Dharma concepts and explains these different concepts, these different practices, these different ideas, all of these transformative things. When they are introduced to us for us to gain a conceptual understanding of them, this is listening. And listening, yes, uses our verbal intelligence, our ability to understand verbal information. And then once we have developed a conceptual, even though it might still be kind of surface level, once we have developed this conceptual understanding, that's where we can start going towards the second step, which is the wisdom of reflection. And the wisdom of reflection is developed through doing different types of reflection. And this is where some of it can come from journaling practices. Those are pretty universally used these days and helpful for so many people, including so many queer practitioners that I'm working with or familiar with. Then we can have meaningful and productive discussions with our peer practitioners. And this is where it is actually valuable to have affinity groups for studying and discussing different topics. Yes, there's absolutely no harm in participating in a big course that's open to everyone. In fact, there's a lot of value in that. But sometimes we might want to discuss the details or the unique aspects of our own experience with regards to all of these things with a group of people who share some of our identities or have gone through similar types of suffering. Let's put it that way. And this is where affinity groups come into play. And in this day and age, more and more Dharma communities are slowly starting to introduce those affinity groups. Once again, not to replace the bigger, more open learning courses and opportunities that they have, but specifically to give people a chance to talk about their difficult experiences with those who have had similar experiences. So discussing this in an orderly way is also a way of developing the wisdom of reflection. In the traditional Tibetan learning context, this is also developed through debate, which is a very specific process with clearly established rules and logic to it. So that's another thing. And then for the next step, once we have performed all of these different types of reflection, including just mentally reflecting on something, let's say as we're taking a walk and deeply contemplating this idea of a precious human rebirth and the fact that while we do have this precious human rebirth, we are in the ocean of samsara. So this precious human rebirth is like a boat that can get us out of this ocean, that can help us cross the ocean. Once we have understood that through all these types of reflection, we move on to the wisdom of meditation. And this is where we apply different types of meditation, including the discursive meditations that teach us to see the world through the lens of a specific idea or of a specific theme, such as the idea of a precious human rebirth. So many, if not most, of the following Bodhisattva verses, many of the following Bodhisattva practices will be focused on us essentially integrating certain ideas into our vision. Yes, there will be some material on concentration meditation. There will be some material related to how to develop the stability of our attention through the practice of shamatha. But a lot of the practices that Thogme Zangpo is introducing, and in a way he extracted them from the larger framework of the teachings of Shantideva, Nagarjuna, and of course the Buddha himself, and many other masters. Many of these points that Thogme Zangpo is presenting have to do with a shift in our vision. And that shift in our vision is accomplished first and foremost through analytical meditations, discursive meditations in which we contemplate something in a very orderly way, integrate something into our vision, and then we rest in a state of concentration on that for a while to make this new state that we have acquired, this new vision that we have acquired, a bit more habitual. So this is where the 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas start. After paying homage to Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of both wisdom and compassion, but especially associated with compassion and the rest of the four immeasurables. After paying homage to Avalokiteshvara and explaining that the general framework here is to introduce these practices, Thogme Zangpo introduces the first practice, which is to recognize the preciousness of our human rebirth and then to use this precious human rebirth in order to absorb, integrate, and embody the qualities of the Dharma. And in order to do that, we need to cultivate step by step these three types of wisdom: the wisdom of listening, the wisdom of contemplation, and the wisdom of meditation. And to be fair, I think one other thing, culturally speaking, that is sometimes missing a little bit in some of the Dharma communities in the West, including the Dharma communities that are currently being created by queer practitioners and queer teachers. One of the things that sometimes is missing is a balance between the three. So there are sometimes groups that do a lot of meditation, but there's not so much learning, at least not so much learning with regards to these foundational teachings, like the teachings of Shantideva, the teachings of the Buddha himself, the teachings of the great masters of Lojong, and so forth. So that kind of falls off the wagon, and then the result, because of that, involves a lot of meditation, but the meditation itself is performed in a worldview that is profoundly different from the worldview of Buddhism. It can be embedded into a very new agey worldview. It can be embedded into a very materialistic worldview. So all these things can totally happen. And this is not to say that this is illegal or anything like that. But if we do want to practice Buddhism itself, or Buddhism proper as it was practiced and preserved by all these great masters of multiple Asian lineages, then it is good to have some of the listening, some of the learning. It is incredibly important to have contemplation, of course, and this is where actually as Westerners, we sometimes go to an extreme in that we do so many group discussions and so much journaling that we kind of overemphasize this point and go to the extreme of being too obsessed with our stories and our journey and everything. So we don't want that, but at the same time, we also don't want to skip on reflection and just do learning and meditation, but never really apply it to the context of our own personal life. So there's a fine balance to be found there. And then, of course, meditation itself is incredibly important. I have come across people who do not do meditation, but they just study Buddhism as a philosophy that's interesting from a conceptual point of view. It is indeed extremely interesting. It is fascinating. But without meditation, without the wisdom of meditation, we would not really see a profound transformation within ourselves. We would not be able to accomplish that transformation. And without that, well, it will still bring us some benefit because these ideas are wonderful, but it would not bring us the emotional, deeper transformation that perhaps is what we're looking for if we want to cultivate greater degrees of happiness. So, just to conclude, this very first verse, the beautiful first verse from this 37 practices of the Bodhisattvas says, "Now that I have this great ship, a precious human life so hard to obtain, I must carry myself and others across the ocean of samsara. To that end, to listen, reflect, and meditate day and night without distraction is the practice of a Bodhisattva."